So today's session, how to grow strong independent businesses and vibrant local economies. Insights from AMIBA is brought to you by the Canadian Community Economic Development Network. We're a national network of several hundred community organizations and individuals working to create local economic opportunities that support an inclusive and sustainable economy. Here you can see some of our members' logos. If you like the session today, consider joining us by becoming a member or signing up for our free e-newsletters or following us on social media. This webinar is part of a series. Past sessions include topics such as youth employment, social return on investment, social impact bonds, mutuals for microfinance, and most recently, collective impact for community change. All of these past sessions are on our website. Allow me to welcome you again. For people who don't like disembodied voices, there's a picture of me. I'll be hosting today's session, and we're very pleased to start off the webinar with a presentation by Jeff Milchin that'll last about 30 minutes. Then for the second half of the webinar, I'll ask him the questions you've posed in the chat box. Once again, you should feel free to post your questions, comments, or any other information you'd like to share in the chat box at any time. But before we get into the presentation, let's get to know each other a bit better with two quick polls of participants. You should see two polls here pop up on the screen, inquiring how you're currently engaged with your local economy. You can check all the boxes that apply there. And the second question is, we'd like to know if there's anything in particular you'd want to learn more about in this webinar. There's a few suggestions there. And while people answer those questions, let me just do a brief intro for the session. So some CCEDNet members will know that we joined the New Economy Coalition last year. This is a mainly US-based network of networks working to shift the economy towards sustainability and fairness. It's been a tremendous learning opportunity to connect to the many dynamic groups doing complementary work in the US. And as I got more familiar with the American landscape, one of the contrasts that struck me is the diversity of business associations in the US compared to what we have in Canada. In particular, the American Independent Business Alliance has developed a very interesting evidence base and approach to building stronger local economies. AMIBA's collected and produced studies quantifying the local economic benefits delivered by independent business, demonstrating how locally owned independent businesses return much more of each dollar in revenue to their communities and contribute to healthier, wealthier local economies. Since Jeff co-founded AMIBA 15 years ago, more than 90 U.S. communities have developed independent business alliances to strengthen locally owned businesses, to prevent the displacement of local entrepreneurs by absentee-owned corporations, and to build more durable and diverse local economies. So we wanted to learn more about AMIBA's four-pronged organizing model, learn some of the key insights on how they create effective local alliances and successful buy local campaigns, and explore interest among Canadian groups to adapt the AMIBA approach for Canada. So we'll be coming back to that question at the end, is how much interest there is to learn more and whether we should be pursuing this collaboration. But before I introduce Jeff, let's just check back in on the poll results. A pretty broad, diverse. Most people shop locally, are helping to build the capacity of local entrepreneurs, are doing local marketing and promotion. Not too many local currencies out there, that's pretty common, and not as many people working on policy. Some rural entrepreneurship, and the Toronto Association of Business Improvement Associations. I think it's great, Tony, thanks. So in terms of what people want to learn from the webinar, it looks like methods of demonstrating value of the local economy and ways to encourage and support greater local entrepreneurialism, as well as solutions to the lack of capital for investment in the local economy are at the top of the list there. I think, Jeff, you'll have some things to say on those in your presentation, eh?
Certainly.
Great. So let's move back to the presentation. Big slides, you can see that a bit better, and let me introduce Jeff Milchin. It's my pleasure to introduce Jeff, who's co-director and co-founder of the American Independent Business Alliance. He spent 15 years helping communities build vital local economies and enhancing economic opportunity by strengthening and sustaining community-based businesses that promote citizen empowerment and community development. Jeff pioneered this organizing model after founding and directing the Boulder Independent Business Alliance in Colorado, starting back in 1998. So thank you for joining us, Jeff.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Mike.
So we're going to turn it over to you, and you'll perhaps start with a bit of background about how what AMIBA is all about and how you got into this.
Absolutely. Well, good morning, everyone, or afternoon on the East Coast. So as Mike mentioned, this got started when I was living in Colorado back in the 90s, and the inspiration for starting the Boulder Independent Business Alliance simply came from watching what was happening to many other communities in the area with a tremendous amount of sprawl development, building of big box centers, weakening of downtowns and other neighborhood serving business districts, and seeing the decay of opportunities and the direct displacement of local entrepreneurs by global chains and absentee-owned businesses. And we simply started out through some mutual introductions, got to know a few other interested local citizens and business owners who shared that concern and the desire to make something different happen in Boulder than we were seeing happening in the communities around us. So the Boulder Independent Business Alliance was a nonprofit that came out of those conversations a few weeks later. And even as we were just getting our feet under us and starting our public outreach, we started getting inquiries from other communities. Boulder attracts a lot of tourists and students from all over the country, so word quickly spread about what we were doing, and we recognized very quickly there was a need for an entity that could help other communities address these same challenges and start sharing the best practices and tools and templates to avoid other communities from having to create things from scratch each step of the way, and to start creating a stronger network for community organizations. So in 2001, Jennifer Rockney, the current co-director of the American Independent Business Alliance, and myself co-founded AMIBA, specifically to serve that role of helping provide tools, resources, ongoing support for other communities, and ultimately start creating a larger voice for the interests of communities and independent businesses that don't have national organizations and PR firms and lobbyists working on their behalf. Because, as in Canada, in many cases, I know we have many situations in which larger corporations are able to translate their economic power into political power and stack the deck against the interests of independent businesses, whether it be tax policy, direct subsidies, and many other forms. There's a real need to have independent businesses and communities unite to address some of those issues proactively. So at its core, the challenge here is kind of between two paradigms of economic development. There's a natural attraction for community officials of any kind who want to appear at that big ribbon-cutting ceremony and say, hey, we're bringing 300 new jobs to this community, even if they're largely going to be displacing existing ones over time. As you all know through your work, the most important investments in building local jobs and opportunities doesn't come hundreds or thousands at a time, but by making the small incremental steps that help new local businesses to form, help existing businesses to grow 1 or 2 employees at a time. And by being a real champion for those smaller but vital steps, that can really help local officials start to pay more attention to those steps that help local entrepreneurs rather than going after the big fish, so to speak. And the other paradigm shift is one where in most communities, even the poorest communities, the challenge isn't necessarily that there's no money coming in or a real lack of money coming in, but especially in the economically challenged areas, that money is leaving very quickly because most of the businesses tend to be absentee-owned. And the largest expenditures, especially when it comes to energy, transportation, food, internet, so few communities are really able to fill those needs locally that most of the money is flowing right out of the local economy. So just like if you have a leaky home, rather than cranking up the furnace or adding heating capacity, you're going to get the most bang for the buck by plugging the leaks. That holds true for local economies as well. So independent business alliances typically engage in at least 2 of these 4 areas of work. We don't necessarily suggest for a new organization that they try to tackle work in all four realms initially, but this provides a good kind of a map of where most of the energy of these local alliances go, and we'll touch on each of these topic areas individually. So first, talk about public education, and we like to frame that as education rather than buy local campaigns, just because it's a little bit broader than trying to influence people's decisions as consumers. It's about getting them to make more conscious choices about their everyday lives, about recognizing the value of entrepreneurship in many different forms. And so we encourage folks, it's okay to use the term buy local campaign once in a while, but keep in mind the value of that broader consciousness raising. So within these campaigns, we encourage folks to think about two specific messaging channels. One, appealing to people's direct self-interest as a customer, but secondly, appealing to people's more altruistic side, what it means for their community, their local economy, and the people around them. You know, part of the challenge is just like, unless you look carefully at the sign like this, we tend to be inundated with corporate marketing messages that say you're going to get the best deals at Amazon, the Walmarts of the world. Unless we get people to really think critically about that, we're losing an important part of the battle. So it's important to know some of the data that really makes a strong case in the other direction in many cases. So Consumer Reports magazine, in many cases, when they look at the value, customer satisfaction of chain businesses versus independents, they consistently find independents getting a stronger overall rating for their value. But in many cases also, on price alone, independents are actually beating their chains despite the economies of scale. In this case, independent pharmacies beat the chain stores, including drugstores and groceries, directly on price alone. The only entities that actually undercut them were warehouse clubs like Sam's or Costco, where you have to pay a substantial annual fee just for the privilege of doing business there. So be aware of some of those examples. And then getting people to think about value as something far more than just price or cheapness alone is an important part of the equation. So this is one example from a hardware store right near our home base of Bozeman, Montana, that does a great job of drawing people's attention to the fact when you walk in their door, you're finding people with years of experience who can serve you immediately, fill your needs, and often educate you about projects in ways you might not expect, and contrast that to the experience of walking into the big box store right across the street from them, literally, where often you'll wander around for many minutes simply to find someone to serve you. So the local multiplier effect is something many of you probably are already familiar with, but worth touching on. It's a key part of the public education process. So when you choose to spend money at a local business, they typically are going to be using far more local inputs than an absentee-owned business in terms of employing local graphic designers, accountants, attorneys, webmasters, you know, a whole array of supporting services, whether they are hiring those people in-house or contracting out with others. That's a huge asset to the local economy. And not only are those the higher wage, higher skilled positions, they're also the ones that are going to create the next generation of entrepreneurs in a community. So, you know, if looking at the retail sector, a big box store comes in, for example, most of the jobs they're creating are clerking and cashier positions, very few higher skilled positions. So that's an important part of the equation. Of course, the local owners are going to be spending money locally, paying local taxes. They also are far more likely to source from other local businesses, be they farmers, ranchers, artisans, small manufacturers. All of those businesses are going to have a far easier time getting onto the shelves at a locally owned business than an outlet of a national corporation or franchise. So as you're seeing here, this adds up to a big impact. this is an average of 10 different studies done over the course of a little over a year by a private U.S. consulting firm called Civic Economics, which also has done some work, I know, for Loco BC and I think a couple of other groups in Canada as well. And the data is very consistent across most communities. So what you're seeing here is when you add up all of those factors, the local labor, the procurement, the charitable giving, and others, a dollar spent at a local independent business is returning more than 3 times as much to the local economy as a dollar spent at an absentee-owned business or a corporate chain. And of course, infinitely more than if you're buying online from a business well outside of your province or outside your country. And when you look at other business categories, this, from the same set of surveys done by Civic Economics, is looking specifically at restaurants. Now here, because restaurants necessarily spend more on labor than many other types of business, the multiplier effect is slightly more comparable. It's higher in both cases, but still, when you look at the overall impact, 65 cents to 66 cents out of every dollar is being recirculated locally when you dine locally, compared to 34 to 35% when that dollar is spent at a chain business. So again, it adds up to a huge impact in terms of enriching the local economy. And it's also important to consider charitable giving. Now, admittedly, Walmart Corporation is a somewhat extreme example. For many other chains, the bar would be up about twice as high. But when we look at the studies out there, which unfortunately are relatively minimal, it would be great to see some more current data analysis done. But at least in the States, we're seeing small businesses typically are shown to give back nearly twice as much to the local communities in which they operate as absentee-owned businesses.
Jeff, if I can just jump in here on this evidence base, which is a tremendous collection. We'll be posting some links towards the end on the slides, because you have an excellent collection on your website, and you see Amy here in the chat box has just put a link to some infographics based on Civic Economics work as well. So this was one of the points that people had mentioned early in the poll as being a specific interest, and I think it really is a remarkable collection of work you've got here. So just so people know, we'll have more links at the end.
Excellent, thank you. And when we talk about telling stories, it's important not just to throw data at people, but to make it connect with their own lives. So this is one example from a local alliance where they did a whole series of ads showing different features in the community that were made possible through the giving of local businesses. So that's not just that abstraction, but it's something that people can see and identify with in their daily lives. And hopefully they'll remember next time they go to a ball game at Legion Field in Bozeman, they'll remember that. This is just, I'm not going to show the video clip, but Dane By Local, this is in Madison, Wisconsin, did a great job of simply polling their members to aggregate that data. And then it's not just, abstract, here's what studies say, it's about their own community, what their local businesses are doing, both in terms of financial contributions and volunteer time giving to local organizations. And again, with the storytelling, it's really important not to just make it about facts and figures, but to reach people emotionally. The most effective persuasion is combining good, sound data and reasoning with really getting at people's own emotions and feelings. And so personalizing your local business is an important part of the equation. Many different independent business alliances have done ad and poster series like this, simply putting names and faces and telling the stories behind their local businesses. So one-size-fits-all messaging really doesn't work when it comes to this kind of public education, and that's why we ask the question, think about specific people or specific segments of your local population. What images and what language and what framing of issues is going to appeal to them? So that's why, when we produce these Why Buy Local posters and web ads, there are many different answers, many of which will appeal to very different demographic groups. So keep that in mind, that it's, of course, you want perhaps one common tagline that you'll use everywhere, but otherwise really think about the specific publication if you're going to be running an ad, the specific audience if you're doing a radio show, what have you, and think about the framing that's going to most appeal to that specific audience. And of course, hopefully you're having a better, more enjoyable experience at your local businesses. Make sure that comes through in your marketing and education as well. And here, this is just an example. Don't assume that everyone really cares about the local economy or job creation. When we were designing some ads to appeal to young people and students, this kind of the approach we took. And while we encourage folks to be overwhelmingly positive and proactive with their messaging, talking about the virtues of locals rather than anti-chain mentality, sometimes a barbed message using a sense of humor can be very effective in breaking through people's consciousness. So in your public education, it's important to think about the opportunities to get into in-depth discussions and the meat of the issues, generating stories or writing your own in local media, talking to people via tabling at local events, and then complementing that with the idea is people should hardly be able to pass a day in your community without seeing evidence that this is the kind of community that cares about supporting local independent businesses. So see here, bumper stickers, T-shirts, banners, posters, many other tools used by alliances to keep that message out there, billboards even. And we frame this as a question of whether these campaigns work, because we've seen as word got out about the success of many local alliances in shifting behavior and purchasing, it seems like hundreds and hundreds of communities started up buy local campaigns that came and went within the span of many months or perhaps a year. So the campaigns are not going to work if they're not sustained over time, or if they're just busted out for the holiday season each year when you're competing with 1,000 other marketing messages. But when they're done properly, and we can talk more about some of the common mistakes perhaps in this discussion period, but when they are sustained over time, when they're done well with this level of sophistication, thinking about different target audiences, using that combination of messaging, they're showing dramatic results. So each year for the past 5+ years, the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, a nonprofit based in the United States, has done nationwide surveys. And what you're seeing here is the results of the year-to-year sales increase at independent businesses and communities served by these local alliances in the green bars compared to independent businesses not served by such alliances in the purple. So year after year, we're seeing dramatic results in terms of those independent businesses served by local alliances reporting much stronger sales growth, 7% versus 2.3% last year. The difference between a very healthy sales increase and barely keeping up with the rate of inflation. And this graph, by the way, will be linked later, can be found on our website under the Buy Local Campaigns tab. It's certainly one that we encourage people to use if you're getting out to try to promote the idea of doing this kind of campaign in your community. So as I mentioned, going beyond speaking just about consumer choices, tell stories about the freedom that independent businesses can provide for folks in the community, the ways in which they help build the community and local economy. Consider working in establishing co-working facilities, small business incubators, shared kitchens. Many of these tools to build a strong local infrastructure can be a key component of building a local campaign as well.
Great. So Jeff, just before we get into the next thing, two things. I'm a little conscious of time because you've got a lot of material and we still have a lot to cover. But the first thing is just to clarify, so the kinds of support around education, marketing, communications that you described here is what AMIBA provides to your member alliances?
Sure. Well, in each of these realms that we're discussing, our job is to provide a wide array of tools and templates and how-tos for different campaigns and activities to build a shared toolbox amongst all of these community organizations so they can learn from the folks who've done something before them. In many cases, take ads, posters, other materials, and just customize with their local name and logo perhaps if they like, and provide ongoing advice and support to help prevent folks from making many of the common mistakes that we've seen previously and share best practices amongst all of them.
And perhaps just before we go much further, it would be helpful, could you give a short definition of what qualifies as an independent business for your networks? Is there a generic standard definition?
Sure. For us, we define it based on, one, at least half of the business being locally owned. Secondly, having the key decision-making authority being residing in the local community. And those really are the two key criteria. One of the links we'll show at the end has the 4-point suggested criteria for that. But those are really the two key components, is the ownership local and is the decision-making power local.
Okay, thanks.
All right, so I'm going to go more quickly through these other realms. So by creating a participatory network amongst your independent businesses, that oftentimes can help them gain power through their ability to collaborate, whether it be group purchasing, collective branding, sharing skills and resources, finding opportunities to help each other. That can be an important part of building a strong local economy. So sharing a group brand, and you see logos here from a few local alliances, including Loco BC in Vancouver, Umpqua is a region in a rural area in Southern Oregon, and then more and more actually independent trade associations such as independent toy retailers in Canada are recognizing the value of doing this kind of work at the national level as well. So the idea is, even if you have a minimal marketing budget, if you can get the member businesses in your organization all using a common logo, putting it in a little corner of their ad, their website, other places, you can very quickly achieve almost universal brand recognition in a way that certainly smaller independent businesses would not be able to achieve individually. In Springfield, Illinois, there are dozens and dozens of businesses using the backside of their business card to spread that awareness, sharing the local organization, sending people to their website. In Boulder, Colorado, when Starbucks Corporation was getting ready to open up its first operation, one of the ways we helped local cafe owners was, as a result of conversations, we found they really needed to band together to be able to do their own custom printing jobs on cups instead of having generic coffee cups out there. So just by having these conversations, figuring out their common interests, we were able to develop an effective new marketing tool for all of these cafes that are jointly listed on the cup, building recognition for the Boulder Independent Business Alliance logo and the pro-local business message, and save them money on their cups in the same time. Co-op advertising spreads, this is an example from an affiliate in North Carolina, can often be effective ways to help support local members as well. So it's important to recognize convincing people that it's a great thing to support your local independent businesses is part of the challenge. The second is you've got to make it easy for them, because even the best intention amongst us will rarely go far out of our way to find a local business if we know we can go right to that website or right to that store to find what we need from a chain. So having an easy-to-use directory, both in print, this example from Think Local Umpqua, on online websites, Live Local Alberta, based in Calgary, in Edmonton is this example. And of course, having either freestanding apps or more typically mobile optimized websites is an important part of that equation as well. Customer loyalty programs developed jointly have been a very effective tool for many different alliances. And the third realm I want to touch on briefly is the importance of having a voice that can speak for the interests of smaller independent businesses in the community, again, who typically can't afford lobbyists in the capitals, who can't afford to have PR firms getting their perspective out there. But local policies can make a huge difference in terms of preventing subsidies that often have flowed toward absentee-owned businesses, creating explicitly pro-local policy initiatives. So I'm not going to get into talking about those options in detail. If anyone has specific questions during the discussion period, certainly would be happy to touch on them. But in all of these realms, creating that strong, unified, and uncompromised voice for the interests of independent businesses can make a big, big impact. And when it comes to buying local, it's important to recognize that consumer decisions obviously are important, but also it's critical to look at what we call anchor institutions, typically nonprofit entities that are rooted by their nature in communities such as schools, universities, hospitals, local governments. Working with these institutions not only can make incremental shifts in helping local businesses prosper, but they can create entirely new opportunities for local entrepreneurs. If you can work with, say, your local hospital to source one or two things locally that they weren't previously, that can create the opportunity to move into a whole new realm of business and plug some substantial leaks in the local economy. So two resources worth pointing out there. Community-wealth.org has a few different publications all about partnering with anchor institutions. And then Loco BC in Vancouver has a guide on their experience working with local anchor institutions that's well worth seeking out.
So the last section is one always of interest, is the question of money and investment, eh?
Right. So I touch very lightly on this, again, in just the interest of time, but we are seeing it becoming perhaps more challenging than ever for new independent businesses to reach the capital they need. And there's a great opportunity here for allowing people in your community who, in any community we go to, if you ask, hey, would you like to be able to get a decent return on your money by investing in your local businesses and local economy instead of sending it off to Manhattan or Toronto? Not to offend anyone from Toronto on the call, but publicly traded corporations are where most people just think, okay, that's where I put my money, whether it be directly or through mutual funds. But we're seeing a lot of innovation right now in how to create opportunities for people to invest locally, provide a needed flow of capital for existing and new local entrepreneurs, while at the same time allowing people to really feel good about where they're putting their money by supporting their local economy instead of national and international chains. And when I talk about the self-reinforcing circle, part of the goal is beyond, again, buy local. If you can get people to think about where my money is invested makes as big a difference as it does where I spend it, get them to invest locally, then they're going to think about that in terms of their self-identity when they're making purchasing decisions. Of course, if you have your money invested in a fund that includes an array of local businesses, you're naturally going to think about patronizing those local businesses first. So just to give a quick recap on what we provide and what we're interested in learning from this conversation is, our energy has been focused on the U.S. We're certainly happy to help any communities in Canada, but I think ultimately there are enough differences in our economy, language, culture, and other issues to hopefully have a group that really is focused on doing what we do, but for Canadian communities. So hopefully we'll get some input on that in the discussion period about whether that may be worth exploring. So on top of the day-to-day work and support, we have a couple of annual campaigns we support. The most relevant coming up for the fall season is called Shift Your Shopping, and that coincides or overlaps with Small Business Saturday that many of you are familiar with. Shift Your Shopping is simply, it's a very grassroots, all-volunteer effort providing tools, templates that other folks can use in your own community. And the idea is to get the pro-local message out there for the entire holiday shopping season. So whereas Small Business Saturday tends to be very focused around the U.S. Thanksgiving holiday, this is a way to keep the message out there on a more extended basis. We provide a wide array of ready-to-use outreach materials to be able to get the message out quickly in your community. And for example, on these posters, you'll see there's a large blank spot in the bottom left corner designed so that local groups can either get them in bulk from us, or they can get a template to put their own name and logo and whatever information they may want to produce locally on those posters. The window decals you see there have been enormously popular since we rolled them out a year ago.
Davis, I'm trying to work up here.
Seasonal ads, again, these are ones many different groups you would find have simply taken this template, plugged their own name and logo in to avoid having to necessarily create everything from scratch. Certainly we encourage groups to use their own local creativity and designers to create material, but it's also nice to have a kind of a ready-made box of templates to work from. We have a wide array of free downloadable tools online, so along parallel with the posters. These are rotating web ads that folks can download and drop into their website or anywhere else they choose online. And this is a free publication that we provide an overview of developing effective buy local campaigns. So we'll have the link up on the screen shortly where you can download that. And you know, the greatest overall value in being part of a national network, whether it's CCED, AMIBA, is that shared experience. So you know, we provide a lot of tools and templates that are useful, but probably the greatest value is developing that common knowledge base, being able to learn the experiences, both the pros and the cons from those who've preceded you, and create that ongoing communication network that can really build a pro-community, pro-localization movement over time. So with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Mike to facilitate the discussion. There's our contact information, and look forward to having some good discussion now.
Thank you, Jeff. That was a lot of information to cram into a short period, and we have a few questions that have been posted in the chat box already. If people have other specific questions you want to pose, go ahead and add them there, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. I'm also going to unsync the presentation so that participants, you should be able to scroll back through some of the slides. If we went too quickly, you'll be able to go back and have another look at them with a bit more care. And so let's go ahead with the questions. One of the first questions that was posed in the chat box is from Tony. When you're talking about buy local programs, Jeff, he asked you for what your take is on programs like the buy local campaigns done by AMEX or the Yellow Pages.
Well, I can't say I'm familiar with the Yellow Pages at all, so that may be specific to Canada, or I may just be totally in the dark about that. As far as American Express Corporation's Shop Small and Small Business Saturday campaign, we have partnered with them actually for the last couple of years. That magazine that I showed on the screen, they actually provided underwriting to produce. So obviously we're grateful that they're putting some investment in real grassroots organizing, as well as the national campaign for their own Small Business Saturday. So I think it certainly has been extremely helpful in getting word out. They also have, by the way, provided underwriting that allows us to provide community presentations and trainings at much lower cost than otherwise possible, which has helped a couple of dozen communities be able to get started. So with that in mind, and our obviously have a non-neutral position toward that, Small Business Saturday I think has been a very positive campaign. Our only concern is that we don't want to see that be just a one weekend wave of publicity. We want that pro-local message to extend, of course, year-round, but when it applies to holiday shopping, to have a little longer lifespan, and that's why we've been working on the Shift Your Shopping campaign for several years now. Very much a grassroots effort that started up amongst a handful of local organizations. We've partnered with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance and Valley doing that in previous years. And so shiftyourshopping.org is the place to learn more about that. And I'll say we very much want to hear from anyone who has ideas on developing new ideas for that program. It's very much driven by grassroots input.
Tony just posted in the chat box that Yellow Pages is new in Canada and modeled after Amex in the U.S., so that might explain where that came from. But you mentioned the contribution from Amex. It raises, I think it's a good tie into the question Chloe posed around funding for AMIBA, and maybe this is even more relevant for the independent business alliances. What's the typical funding structure? Do they survive on membership dues, or do they need to solicit contributions from other sources?
Local alliances typically have a diversified funding base. We certainly encourage that. That includes membership dues on the part of local businesses who are benefiting from their work. That typically will involve a premium level membership for groups that want to have a banner up at events or on the website. It may include doing some service contracts with their local governments to do pieces of work that are helping build the local economy that local governments also want to support, identifying new opportunities for entrepreneurs or plugging leaks in the local economy, for example. Some of them have engaged in getting foundation support, some in sales of cause-related merchandise. So we strongly encourage that the local groups have a variety of different funding streams, but membership dues are probably the most consistent and reliable amongst those. So it's healthy to have that be a significant portion of the budget. In terms of AMIBA's funding, we get some revenue from the affiliation fees that local groups pay. That's a money-losing piece of our programming. The money we charge doesn't cover the full cost of the service we provide, so we also have some corporate sponsorships from companies that do not compete against local independent businesses. So while we do have some sponsorship from American Express, we certainly are not going to be taking that from Home Depot or anyone who would be competing against our constituency. We, through speaking events at larger conferences and trade shows, generate some of our revenue that way. So we have a few different funding streams that help support doing the direct support for community organizations as a money-losing proposition in a nutshell.
Early on, as we were asking about people's interests, Laura, Doreen, and Sandra all mentioned rural entrepreneurship as a particular area of interest. I was wondering, are there factors that you take into consideration when you're supporting particular rural IBAs? Is there a minimum sort of population size or area that you try to work with or that is required? What is are there specific success factors for independent business campaigns in rural areas?
Sure. Well, a number of our affiliates have worked in rural areas, and typically they will cover a much larger region than a more urban-based alliance. How exactly those boundaries should be drawn is there's really no general rules to suggest. It's really just a matter of where people identify with on a personal level and geographically. Sometimes the physical geography may play a large role in determining that. We tend to encourage folks to base their geographic scope more on those factors than on arbitrary political boundaries that divide one city from another or one county from another. But there are many groups that are working across a very large rural area. I think Local Umpqua was one of the examples actually used on the screen in the slideshow, where they cover an enormous chunk of southwestern Oregon, with Roseburg with about 15,000 people to 20,000 being the largest city, and then there being dozens and dozens of very rural communities in that area. So there certainly are strong examples out there. If anyone wanted kind of a list of some of the rural-focused alliances, I'd be happy to just send by email. Here are a few of the ones that really focus largely on rural communities. So the challenges are somewhat different, obviously, but the basic organizing model, and this is one of the things that's most exciting for us, it's really worked in communities of every political ideology, economic circumstance, population base. Wherever people are dedicating the time and energy to do this and build a strong organizational infrastructure, they've really had some significant successes. Also, there are some organizations in the states we've partnered with, such as rural development initiatives in Oregon, that provide great complementary support. So one of the areas where I'd like to learn more is what are some of those parallel organizations in Canada, and where can those partnerships be forged?
Excellent. Well, perhaps people have some suggestions on that in the chat box. In the meantime, you talked a bit earlier about the importance of procurement and anchor institutions as potential sources for demand. Sandra asked a question, where do you stand on community benefit clauses in public sector RFPs, working with perhaps either local, state, or national governments? Have you done any work on community benefit clauses?
Well, broadly, I'd say we're very supportive of that. Whenever you're talking about taxpayer expenditures, there's every reason to make sure that that public interests are being served, such as a significant portion of any jobs or expenditures going to community-based businesses, whether they be private independent businesses, cooperatives, worker-owned. That absolutely should be a consideration in any public contracting. The material I mentioned from community-wealth.org, actually they have some extensive resources in that department as well. So the broad answer in terms of where do we stand, I'd say strongly supportive.
Are you aware, have community benefit clauses been used in public procurement that you're aware of to support IBAs specifically, or members, I guess, local independent businesses?
I would say so, but I don't know if I can come up with specific citations off the top of my head, Mike. I'd be happy to take a look at that and come up with examples.
Yes, well, perhaps if Sandra has wants specific examples, we can follow up afterwards. That would be neat.
I saw one question previously about the difference between AMIBA and BALI that Philip asked that I thought I should touch on.
Yeah.
Our focus is overwhelmingly on providing direct support for local organizations. So we provide guidance on every stage of the process, from initial meetings through incorporation, establishing boards, best practices, providing extensive documentation of all of the core activity areas of local alliances. Whereas I think, my own perception from having worked with BALI and actually went to one of their conferences earlier this year for the first time is there's a lot more emphasis on personal communication, on connecting individuals, and I think that is probably the single biggest difference. Is our focus is more on supporting local organizations and connecting them, and I think BALI's is more on focusing on individuals. There certainly is a bit of a different emphasis in that our emphasis is based on local ownership and building local economies first, rather than on the sustainability message being primary. In our view, if you're going to talk about having a more sustainable economy, local ownership is the key step to that. I don't want to go off on a tangent, but when we're talking about publicly traded corporations, I'd say we're extremely skeptical of the possibility for there being anything that could be called social responsibility. That if you want to have businesses making a positive impact, you've got to talk about having either locally rooted ownership, cooperatives, or worker-owned, and really looking at every opportunity to shift money away from publicly traded corporations toward community-based enterprise.
So just building a bit on the services that AMIBA offers, Philip asked what kind of staff or how do you structure the support that you provide to your members?
Well, essentially, we have, when folks join us, there's a huge online resource library that they then have access to. And then, for the most part, it's up to them to say, here's what we're thinking about doing and what guidance can you offer, what connections can you offer. We're always there to provide feedback, whether it's on editing op-eds for a local newspaper, providing feedback on designing ads, logos, campaigns. We're there by email, by phone, continually to help provide whatever feedback, connections, and support we can to folks. So, and the other part of it is serving as a communication hub. So oftentimes, if folks come to us, hey, we're interested in doing Project A, well, we know that the Independent Business Alliance in Tacoma, Washington did that last year. We put them in touch and say, here are the folks to talk to about that specific program. So more and more as time goes on, we're doing less creating of new material and resources and simply being the connector to create that library of resources and know who to direct people to for the direct experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the real power is in the peer-to-peer connections.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the next question then from Shahil in Toronto actually, I think, illustrates the link between CCEDNet and AMIBA because it's really about community building. And his example is in a community where the businesses are scattered, there's not a lot of cooperation or alignment of businesses. Where do you start? How do you start building interest in an IBA?
Well, really trying to find one area where there's the greatest opportunity to create a specific success that you can then build on. So that's one of the reasons why, we have the 4 different program areas we talk about, but encourage folks, if they're starting a new entity especially, it's probably best not to try to take on work in more than 2 of those initially. And really, the way an organization develops momentum and energy and attracts new people, retains the energy of the people getting involved initially, is to build small but concrete accomplishments. So rather than, you may have a fairly grand vision about what you want to accomplish in the community, but the more you can say, here are these accomplishments that this organization has made in its first 6 months, year of operation, even if they look relatively small, that's what's going to build energy and attract further interest. So choosing based on your local conversations what that initiative would be is what we suggest as a first step.
Yeah, and I think in our experience with community organizing, the relationships really are the currency of moving things forward. So starting just by connecting with people and identifying what that greatest need is and building slowly from there, I would agree is
and I might just add, in response to that question, the coffee cup purchasing was one example where it's important to have the group conversations, but then also look at specific business clusters, maybe have some direct conversations amongst them and find out where might there be one common need or one common thing that could help those businesses. So having those more narrowly focused conversations are at least as important as the larger group discussions.
Well, we're just about out of time. I think Moselle might have been typing a question, but before we wrap up, the question that we want to put out to everyone on the call here today is, what do you need to move forward, and what kind of interest is there in supporting local economies, independent business alliances, capitalizing on the tremendous tools and resources that AMIBA has developed in the U.S. for potential application here in Canada? And so we'll be looking for your feedback as well as your interest or not in terms of what some next steps should be and how any of AMIBA's resources need to be adapted, or perhaps they work well just as they are. I think that four-pronged strategy probably sounds pretty universal. A lot of the marketing tools seem pretty applicable as well for use in Canada. What would you need to move forward if you wanted to build this kind of local independent business alliances in Canada? So I'm going to resync the presentation here and post up a few resources. We'd mentioned all the way through that this slide was coming, and so these are all clickable. If you want to click on a few of them quickly here, you can get some of these resources, and of course we'll be sharing the slides and the recording after, so you can go back and look up some of these more. But AMIBA has a lot of resources that you can browse on their website, and there's a few others here from Canada on the right column that are also relevant. And if you'd like to stay in touch around CED and CCEDNet related issues, of course, check out the CCEDNet website and sign up for CCEDNet's free email newsletters. You should have also just received an email. Everyone registered for the session should have got an email with a link to a 1-minute evaluation survey. So please take a second and fill that out quickly. It should be really easy to do, and your feedback is important to us, especially because this survey is a bit different from other surveys. We added 2 more questions at the end there. One is for you, whether you're interested in finding out more about applying AMIBA's tools and resources in your community. Yes, no question. If yes, just type in your email address and we'll be able to follow up with you depending on how much interest there is. So we're just about out of time. A big thanks once again to Jeff for sharing a unique perspective and the remarkable resources AMIBA has developed. And thanks to all the participants for the questions and participation today. The webinar recording will be posted shortly. We'll send the link to everyone as soon as it's available. And thanks everyone for your participation. Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, Michael, just want to add one thing. Want to make sure folks are aware that you don't need to decide, oh, I'm going to join AMIBA to be able to get our help. We're happy, and we do, every day. We help folks who are just in the early stages of thinking about developing a local campaign or organization, so please don't hesitate to ask questions by email or by phone. We're happy to help folks as they're developing their